Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcasts and YouTube videos. I am in the midst of a snowstorm here in northeastern PA, which has depressed me greatly because those who know me know that I consider winter to be the invention of the Antichrist. So anyway, but I'm very excited because I'm joined by Pastor Paul Vander Klay. Some of you may be familiar with him, some of you may not. And quite frankly, I wanted to have him on the show because he's a very popular podcaster, and I might say a very good one. He's one of my favorites, and I don't watch a lot of them or listen to a lot of them. And so, welcome to the show today, Paul.
Thank you, Larry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I was on your show once, maybe about a year ago.
Yep.
Thanks to the interventions of certain Mr. Cale Zeldin.
Yeah. Kale's a connector. He brings a lot of people
Oh,
together.
is he ever? I just interviewed Rod Dreher because of Cale's
Yeah.
connections. Hey, have you interviewed Rod Dreher at all yet on his new book, Living in Wonder?
I haven't done it on his new book. I want to finish the book before I talk to him about it. But I've spoken with Rod a few times in the past, and I actually it was probably Rod's blog, I think, early on had kind of a formative influence on me, even
Me
as a
too.
reformed pastor. So Rod's got a lot has had a lot of influence. So we can talk about Rod as we
I
go
think
on.
yeah, we'll get on. Yeah, we'll definitely get into Rod because it kind of plays into some of the things that I like about your podcast, which is you hit upon a lot of the same things that I like to hit upon is the need for re-enchantment. My friend Michael Martin, who's into sophiology and stuff, and Mike Sauter, they like that kind of stuff too. But anyway, I want let's just sort of start to begin. I'm going to assume that most of my viewers have no idea who Paul Vander Klay is. So give us a little. Where were you raised? Where did you go to school? What theological tradition do you flow out of? What made you decide to become a pastor, and so on?
Okay. So I am a minister in the Christian Reformed Church of North America. That is a split off of the Reformed Church in America. Dutch Calvinist is the theological tradition. I'm a third generation minister in that. So my father was a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, and my grandfather was a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. My great
Wow.
grandfather was a house painter and an artist. And he was the one who came to America first, sent by his father, who was a Jew in the Netherlands. And I wish I knew the story. I think he married a Dutch girl, got thrown out of the Jewish community, saw that he had no future in the Netherlands, and so sent his son to Ellis Island in the 1890s. And uh, he went to Grand Rapids area, Michigan, Spring Lake, Muskegon, that area,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
settled in. And once he got settled, he brought the rest of his father and his mother and a brother and a sister over. And then when they got to West Michigan, they sort of assimilated amongst the Dutch and lost their Jewish. They threw away their Jewish names. They threw away their Jewish identity because I would imagine at the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't a lot to be gained by being a Jew in that area of the country. So and actually, we didn't find this history out until about 15 years ago. We sort
Wow.
of someone did a genealogy on my father and said, you know, there's something you should know about yourself. You're actually of Jewish extraction, and this genealogist also had this thing where he'd find your closest, most famous relative, and my closest, most famous relatives of all the wonderful Nobel laureate Jews that are out there. My closest, most famous relatives are the Marx brothers. So there you go. Groucho, Harpo, the whole
Are
gang.
you serious? Oh
I am
my God.
serious. I am
Oh,
serious.
that is fantastic. Well, your stock just rose greatly in my eyes. If I was such a fan of the Marx, and this younger generation probably has no appreciation
No,
for
no, no. So the
the
Marx
the, sh-
brothers.
the sheer comedic
Yeah.
genius of the Marx. But okay, so
So my
you,
my father's side settled into West Michigan, and then my grandfather grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, when his mother died in childbirth with their sixth child, and so my grandfather then was raised in Grand Rapids and became went to what was, the ministerial prep thing in the denomination, became a Christian Reformed minister. His father died on his wedding night to my grandmother. They had the big wedding
Oh,
planned, and my
jeez.
great grandfather had a stroke that same day. So they canceled the wedding. The minister came in, did a little quickie wedding, and then off my grandfather and his wife went to Wisconsin to have their first church. That's when my father was born. So my father was raised in the Christian Reformed Church in mostly agricultural communities in the Midwest, Minnesota, and so on. And the Christian Reformed Church at that point was a conservative, isolated Dutch Calvinist denomination, very much part of one of these little ethnic denominations all over the country before the Second World War that the Second World War would sort of disrupt. And then my father, my mother was from Whitensville, Massachusetts, which is a little Frisian enclave of the Christian Reformed Church.
Hmm.
And they came over with the cows. And then that my parents met at Calvin College, which was sort of the spawning ground for Christian Reformed people, where you'd go to the Christian college to meet a spouse. And then my father then took a church in Paterson, New Jersey, where the Dutch had sort of settled fairly early on. But then after the Second World War, the Dutch prospered economically, moved out to the suburbs out of the old grimy city of Paterson. African Americans moved up. The Dutch sort of had a little mission in there, and my father was called right out of seminary to turn this little mission into a chapel or a real church. And so I grew up then in a mostly African American community, but the Christian Reformed Church has Christian day schools. So I went to a Christian day school, but had a mostly African American church, and those were pretty formative for me in terms of my identity because the racial reconciliation or the racial, the civil rights movement then happens in Paterson. Heroin goes through all of these things sort of shape the church that my father's church continued to evolve to be this racial reconciliation church. And so that was very much what formed me politically, formed me ecclesiastically. And I was just always sort of a hybrid of lots of different cultures in that North Jersey area.
Oh, that's a fascinating story. I didn't realize you grew up in North Jersey there in
Yeah.
that Paterson area. My wife is a North Jerseyite, although she's from a little further west than Paterson, the Lake Apacon region.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sparta, New Jersey is
Yeah,
where
beautiful.
my wife hails from. But anyway, that's so. Where did you go to get your theology degrees?
So then I went to Calvin College, as
Okay.
is the tradition in my denomination, and I eventually got a history degree from Calvin. But about my fourth year there, I decided I wanted to go to seminary, but I didn't want to be a local church pastor. But I really enjoyed theology, and I really enjoyed working in the church and doing ministry. So I was going to go out to Fuller Theological Seminary because I felt a little too ingrown in the CRC. But then my senior year, I met a woman that, we'd eventually marry. So then I stayed at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids and got my degree there. And then right after Calvin Seminary, while I was in Calvin Seminary, I married my wife and her parents. She had grown up. Her father was a Lutheran missionary to Nigeria, and her mother was it's a very funny, she was a fundamentalist Baptist. And how a Lutheran and a Baptist get along. Well, so they were missionaries in Nigeria, but he had malaria so bad from his years there that they eventually went to Eastern Michigan, and he pastored a little Lutheran church there. He died in a car accident when my wife was 13. But my
Oh,
wife had always wanted to do foreign missions, so then we wound up doing my first 7 years in ministry, wound up doing ministry in the Dominican Republic amongst Haitians.
oh, where I lived in the Dominican Republic for a year in Santiago. I don't
Okay,
know.
we were in Barahona, which
I
is in the southwest
Yeah,
area near Haiti.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I worked as a church developer. That was my title. I mostly
Well,
worked with local
not to
pastors.
interrupt your narrative, but this is really interesting because when I lived in Santiago, I lived with a family, and they were being paid by the. I was down there learning. I was a seminarian learning Spanish, and so the family was getting paid to house this nerdy little American seminarian. It was kind of a middle class Dominicano family, uh, and they had Haitian servants
Yep.
who they treated like absolute dirt
Yep.
and paid even worse.
Yeah.
And it was my first real education as a young seminarian in real overt racist. I mean, growing up in the United States, I grew up in Nebraska, in white bread Nebraska. I went to a school that had a certain number of African Americans, and probably more than any other in Lincoln, Nebraska. So, I had some black friends and so on, but I had never really encountered racism until I went to the Dominican Republic and realized how stratified Dominican society is.
Yeah.
Between those of pure European, you know the thing,
Yep.
pure
Yep.
European descent, then mixed, and then the indigenous, and then the Haitians are at the very bottom of the bottom of the bottom.
Yep. Yep. No, that's very true. And so we worked with the Haitians. And it was interesting that I noticed that Americans could work with Haitians, Puerto Ricans could work with Haitians. The Dominican Haitian thing was just really tough to see, even though many of the people I worked with had been in the country, some of them had been in the country a little while. They had begun to intermarry with Dominicans. And I tell the story often. There was one Sunday where we baptized a guy, included him in official church membership, and ordained him in the same day and married him. And the reason was that in the Christian Reformed Church of the Dominican Republic, you couldn't be an official member of the church unless you were legally married to the woman you were living with. By this point, he had had 17 children with her already. But and so the way he managed, but to be legally married, you needed official identification in the country. You need to be documented. And so basically the way a lot of this would work would be that Haitians would find a Dominican who could swear that this was their child. So then you would get a Dominican birth certificate, and then you could get married. And once he was married, then he could become an official church member. And once he was an official church member, then he could become the pastor of the local church. All of that happened in the same day. And when you have these
Wow.
kinds of situations, he had been preaching and teaching, he had been a leader of that church already, but they couldn't make it official until they had this one little bit of fraud they needed to do to make him a Dominican to make the whole thing work.
All right. Well, what is the? I mean, what years were you there? Let me start with that.
I was there from 90 to 97.
90 to 90. So 7 years. How
Yeah.
many Protestants are in the Dominican? How many Haitian Protestants are in the Dominican Republic?
Well, in the DR, they would basically say there are Catholics and there are Christians, which, of course, to North American ears is like, what do you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Because to be a Dominican or a Haitian in many ways is to be Catholic.
Yeah. That's my
And
point.
so
Yeah.
then you'd have this, throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there's this big evangelical movement in much of Latin America. And so many, many people, I don't know the numbers, but a decent percentage of Haitians and Dominicans have now become evangelical. And that would
Yes.
mean now there are also some, I would meet some very devout Catholics, but the percentage of nominal Catholics in the culture was huge. And there was
Yeah.
also this association between the Catholic hierarchy in the country and government corruption. And so evangelicals were a little bit out of step, but the evangelical in a lot of the evangelical churches they had an expectation of discipline. And so if you're an evangelical, if you're a woman, you wouldn't wear slacks, you wouldn't wear makeup. If you're a man, you wouldn't wear shorts. So it was fairly legalistic, but also with some of that legalism and discipline came if you were an evangelical man, you wouldn't drink, you wouldn't gamble, you wouldn't smoke, and any money that you made had to go to your family and your wife and your children. So in Latin America, you had this evangelical lift where because the
Yeah.
men, by virtue of this evangelical discipline and rigor and sometimes legalism, it would actually elevate their families. And so that was a big piece of what was happening in evangelical
Yeah.
churches.
That was just I was there in 82, and the rise of evangelicalism all across Latin America. And that's why I'm
Yep.
asking doing a dive into this, because it's pertinent to what's going on down there right now. And it was just beginning then. When I was there, it was like tons of, like you said, nominal Catholics, lukewarm Catholics, just tons of them. And then there was this little small number of very, very devout Catholics. Uh, that was very matriarchal, by the way. And
Mm.
then, well, I'll get to that in a second. But then the alternative, if you weren't either one of those things, the alternative was actually more of a Santeria,
Yes.
more in that voodoo kind
Yep.
of direction than
Yep.
any kind of evangelicalism. And so, but the evangelicals were definitely starting, and I understand what you're saying. What's interesting is that when I would go to mass, I would go to mass at the cathedral in Santiago, and I noticed that the only people that were at mass were the women and the children, and the men were all outside playing dominoes and smoking cigarettes.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And
So
I
if you
thought
became an evangelical,
that ended.
no more dominoes, no more cigarettes, no more chasing women, no more hanging out at the bar. You go to work, you love your wife, and if you don't, your local church pastor is going to be on your tail.
Yeah.
And that's what happened that's a lot of what's happened in Latin
So
America.
yeah, it's really, this is just, I could spend the entire hour just talking about this, because there's so many ramifications. I know, for example, Clovis Boff has just written a book, and he's the brother of the liberation theologian Leonardo Boff, and he's just written a very famous book. I can't remember the name of it now, and I haven't read it. I don't want to pretend that I have, but I've read little reviews of it where he is critical of liberation theology and the Latin American Catholic Church for not focusing on the very kinds of things that you were just talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the need for the church to actually have simply provided people with this matrix of family living and access to the supernatural, which is not to be ignored at all. Instead, the Catholic Church became a sort of philanthropy outfit, and sort of lost its way. Very, very interesting critique, I think, of many things that are going on in Latin America. Um, but anyway, I want to move then on to, so you're now a pastor, and what sort of I want to get to your theology now. I'm stammering and hemming and hawing here. What are you theologically, and in a sense, how does that play out in your role as a pastor in your church? What kinds of things does your theology inform as you engage your life as a pastor?
Well, I think I think at least I consider myself within my own theological tradition of Dutch Calvinism. Um, I don't see myself as having left that. Although once I started a YouTube channel, a bunch of other kinds of, not so much CRC people, but Presbyterians and some of these people would listen to me and they'd say, well, you're not a real Calvinist, because the real Calvinists they imagined were more like John Piper and these young restless and reformed, I'd say neo-Puritan, um, very conservative reformed Calvinist churches, often Reformed Baptists that began focusing on divine election and some of these other
So kind of
elements.
Calvinist scholastics, kind of
Yes,
neo-scholastic Calvinist kind of a deal.
yes. And whereas in the Christian Reformed Church, it was always a conservative, reformed, 5-point Calvinist denomination, it was also a Dutch denomination, which meant that the Dutch culture added a degree of practicality and familiarity with the theology that sort of gave I would say, a flexibility in the theology that afforded a degree of openness. And so, even with my upbringing, so on one hand, my father, like me, was raised in this denomination, and it's a confessional denomination. So we have a form of subscription that we subscribe to the Heidelberg
Right.
Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. So those are the doctrinal documents
Yeah.
that we subscribe to, and the Christian Reformed Church has long seen itself as it's like many Protestants, we see ourselves as you know Catholics with some reservations. So we see ourselves as part in the Apostles' Creed. We declare ourselves to be part of the Holy Catholic Small C Church, not the Roman Catholic Church, and roughly we see ourselves again within Latin Christendom. So, and I think the way that, and I was actually thinking about this morning because I've been trying to do some work on the Heidelberg Catechism on my channel, which is a tricky thing given the breadth of the audience that I have. Almost
Yeah.
any theological point you raise, you're going to get shot at by someone. And I still remain comfortably as a Calvinist in that I think finally salvation is of the Lord. And God seems to work in strange ways in this world, often with surprising people. And I think for me, in many ways, that sort of turns me into kind of a mere Christian in C.S. Lewis's vein, where I don't have. So I've seen, downstream of my work in the Peterson Peugeot pipeline. I know some of my audience have become Orthodox, and they're and I celebrate that. I'm glad that you've joined the Orthodox Church. And some of my audience has have sort of renewed their allegiance and their loyalty to the Catholic Church. And I say, I'm glad you're now a faithful Catholic. And some of my audiences are Protestant, and a lot of my audience is sort of still trying to figure out what to do about church. So in that sense, I'm very much a mere Christian in that I am not going to forefront the theological differences between what I believe are the historic Christian churches. And what I've also noticed is that a lot of the things that divide our churches, while theologically important and significant and worthy of debate and conversation and discussion, aren't always terribly functional in the life of the laity.
That's right.
I began so when I moved back to North America, Jehovah's Witnesses, because I live again in a very diverse area of Sacramento, Jehovah's Witnesses would regularly come to my door on a Saturday morning, and if I had time, I would sit down with them, and of course they wanted to promote the Jehovah's Witness faith to me. But I was always nosy, and so I would start asking them questions, and they get all excited, like, oh, someone's not slamming the door. They're interested in what I
Oh,
think.
I've done the same. This is
Yeah.
great. Go ahead.
And so I start to probe them because I want to find out, okay, you're the foot soldiers of the Jehovah's Witness. How defined is your Christology really? Where is your theological map? And you begin to notice that at least a lot of the door knockers, they don't know a lot. They've joined this church because they need something, and it provides some community to them. And the theological distinctivenesses are a little ways down. And again, when I say this kind of thing, people think that these theological distinctions are unimportant. I'm by no means saying that, but they do, I think, manifest all the way up. I'd also play a game sometimes if I had a Sunday off and I was going to visit another church in Sacramento, because in a small church, if I go to my church on Sunday, it's not a Sunday off, no matter if I'm preaching or not preaching. It's just the way it is to be a pastor. So I would go into some of these often big box evangelical churches and I play a little game with myself. I would try to find the Protestant tradition that was behind the big box non-denominational facade, and almost within 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the language of the pastor, okay, there's a Methodist, there's a Baptist, there's a Presbyterian, because these theological differences are important and they do manifest themselves eventually, but the vast majority of people are now formed predominantly by the media they consume, the movies they
Yeah.
watch, the party they tend to align with, the friends that they have. And I think what that means is that all of the church traditions now in North America are really sort of on their back foot in terms of theological formation and catechesis of their members, where you'll have a tiny little layer within your church that is committed, self-conscious about their theological tradition and practices, but the majority of people are basically interfacing with their church with sort of a pragmatic filter.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what that means, especially in a Protestant church where we prioritize, um, where we prioritize, teaching from the pulpit. One of the things you learn as a Protestant preacher is that not a lot gets through, which is a very humbling thing as a preacher to recognize. And it
Hey,
isn't
I was a
that
theology professor and I could say the same thing. Not a whole
exactly.
lot got through.
That's right. And so for me, that puts me on a journey to say,
And if I may,
okay,
if
yeah, go
I may
ahead.
interrupt, if I really may interrupt again, but my former colleague Rodney Hauser and I would often laugh and say, "Thank God no one believes in theology, because there's so much crap theology out there that it's almost a blessing that theology is goes over the heads of most people."
Right.
So anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you, Paul, but go
No,
ahead.
so I think actually, with the relationship between I not too long ago read Carlos Ayre's wonderful book Reformations, which I thought, especially having grown up in a tradition where we were catechized, and I'm not saying improperly so, into okay, I can find books from the 1960s in the Christian Reformed Church that, okay, here we start with the apostles. And then suddenly everything jumps to the Reformation. And it's like, there's kind of 1400 years in there that maybe someone would have said something about. And well, we embrace the Nicene, so we embrace the councils a bit because they made our creeds. And so we're Trinitarian, but there's always sort of the idea that, well, everything got lost until Luther and Calvin, and then, the Dutch embrace of it. And so we just sort of, the Christian Reformed Church in 1950 is the only perfect manifestation of the apostolic church in the world. And where many people sort of didn't necessarily buy that, um, there was sort of a kayfabe, sort of about that. And so what
Yeah.
we're seeing now is, well, with the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant, Luther and the printing press forced the Roman Catholic Church to change in a lot of ways. And so then you have the
Oh, yeah.
Council of Trent, and now that the Orthodox are on the scene and in the conversation, who never passed through any of this, it gets very interesting when I hear Baptist converts to Orthodoxy take a look at um, English pre-Reformation English churches and saying, "Wow, they're kind of like the Orthodox." And Carlos Ayre nicely brings that out in his story about some of the ways that the Protestant Reformation sort of forced changes in the Roman Catholic Church. And I think what this forced for a lot of us is a hyper confessionalism, especially in Protestant churches, where here all of these little churches are defining all of their theological categories with an enormous amount of precision. And at least until the 20th century, could sort of count on enough isolation and enough tribal competition between the various Christian tribes to sort of keep their fold in line. And what happens, especially after the Second World War, is that all breaks down. And you find Roman Catholics in North America all over the map. And a previously very disciplined church like the Christian Reformed Church that really was very successful in establishing a monoculture through its Christian schools and its retirement homes and its churches and all of these things to sort of ensure a monoculture after the Second World War. All of those monocultures break down, and that's why we have the rise of evangelicalism. One of the things we don't talk enough about is the main line and the collapse of the main line into what is basically now the woke and the Democratic Party. And so there's just we're just living in this swarm of influences where if you meet someone in the pew of a Catholic church or a Reformed church, you really have to sit down and start talking to them to find out what do you sort of believe? And then you have to then ask, to what degree are those beliefs actually tied to their practices and their allegiances and their identities? And so we're in a time of almost unmeasurable chaos in all of our churches. And the downside, of course, of that is all of the traditions are struggling. The upside of that is you and I can have this conversation.
Yes. Yes. And that's important. I mean, and also the boy, I was just mesmerized by what you were just talking about, how the monochrome cultures have broken down, and there's just this, as Rod Dreher calls it, liquid modernity has created this chaos within all of the various churches. I often get into debates with hyper traditionalist Catholics who want to blame the decline of that pre-conciliar Catholic monoculture on the council, and so on. That any attempt at altering the faith, as they say in various trad publications, altering the faith, which meant altering that monochrome Baroque Catholic sort of culture, any attempt at that is exactly what led to these problems. But as you correctly point out, and I say to them all the time, this process of dissolution, this process of centrifugal forces pulling things apart was inevitable. It's built into the very fabric of modernity and across the board. And it's not just happening in Christian religions. It's happening in all religions. But before we comment further on that, I want to come back. When I was a young guy, I wasn't into ecumenism. I was this fire breathing confessional Catholic. I'm still, obviously, I'm a very conservative Roman Catholic, all through and through and through to my bones. So no doubt about that. But my point is that when I was a young guy, I was a real fire-breathing Tridentine Catholic kind of guy, and no time for the false hereticism of this false ecumenism. The Protestants just need to convert, and that's that, and so on. And as I've gotten older and older and older, I've seen the value of the ecumenical movement on a couple of fronts. First, the historiography that it is introduced to both sides, so that a conversation could be had between you and I. For example, the Protestant version would be the Christian church really, the Luther's version of the church really did exist from day one, from New Testament times on through, but it was like this subterranean, oppressed little minority under the horrible oppression of this terrible pagan Catholic hierarchy. And Luther was there to simply retrieve them. I mean, so many people tend to think that Luther and Calvin invented this sort of pan-Protestant denominational thing that was, no, they believed that there was only one true church, and it was us. Okay. And that they had just recovered it from the horrible Catholics or whatever. That historiography of extreme Catholic rupture with true Christianity is really dead. But likewise, the Catholic sort of version of that says exactly what you said. Oh my goodness, the Holy Spirit brought the church into horrible error and it took until 1517 for Martin Luther to point things out. Well, yeah, there's a sort of element. I'm Catholic, so I'm going to say there's a certain element of truth in that observation. Nevertheless, my point would be that I think history would show that some form of Protestantism was inevitable. It was simply because of human freedom and the fact that people some version of apostolic succession in the hierarchy with bishops as successors of the apostles and the whole bloated sacramental system of hierarchy and magisterium and pope. Some version that said no to that was kind of almost inevitable that it would emerge in Europe of some kind. And so the Catholic version of this would have to acknowledge that within Latin Christianity, Nicene Christianity, as you there was always latent within it the potential for some version of Protestantism. And that's why I now think, and this is why I love your podcast, more and more, and doctrines are obviously important. You and I both agree doctrines are important. And I'm going to shut up in a second and let you talk because you're the guest. But doctrines are important. But nevertheless, I think the divide now isn't so much between Dutch Reform and Roman Catholic, or Lutheran and Roman Catholic, or Lutheran and Dutch Reform. The divide is between Christians who want to retain some element of the enchantments of traditional Christianity, that Christians who get that we are in a cultural crisis, Christians who get the specific weight, as Lewis would call it, the weight of glory, the kabod of Christ, and those who don't. And those who don't, and thus I often say I have much more in common, often with a Lutheran who thinks that way, who sees the crisis, and or than I do with a Catholic who thinks, men can get pregnant.
Yeah, it's well, we're in a the crisis is okay. One of the things that's so we're in this period of late modernity, and late modernity has sort of created a worldview among people broadly in and outside the church that basically suggests that, again, there's materiality, and it's the soul subtraction story that Charles Taylor talks about. It's materiality, and
Yeah.
then eventually consciousness arises. But consciousness, whatever it is fundamentally an illusion, and all we are is the product of natural forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many Roman Catholic and Orthodox, nominalism has sort of become the boogeyman now for many. That okay, everything sort of went astray with respect to nominalism, and I think that the truth is that human beings are incredibly imaginative in ways that we can find to stray. I mean, whenever
Yes.
we sort of pin down one boogeyman or one target, I think um, we are failing to appreciate the creativity with which we apply to uh, our rebellious nature. So part of what I see happening is we are having a much more sober recognition of just how complex human life really is. But see, but part of what's happening, I think, is that we're not just having this disruption and dislocation within churches. The same disruption and location is happening within philosophy and science. And I got
Yes.
into a lot of this crazy stuff through watching Jordan Peterson and watching him approach the Bible. There's plenty someone could critique Jordan Peterson on in various ways, but watching him sort of approach the Bible. And then from Jordan Peterson, I met Jonathan Pageau and then John Vervaeke. And as I began to be in conversation, much more specifically with Pageau and Vervaeke, but at least watching a lot of Peterson stuff, began to appreciate how much of our theological systems and ecclesiastical systems and practical systems were dependent on these massive cultural movements that happened in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries.
Yeah.
One of the books that really helped me with this was a Roman Catholic theologian out of Regina, Canada. His mother was watching my podcast and said, "Oh, you should, Brett Sockold, you should talk to Paul Vander Klay." And so I get this book in the mail. It's called Transubstantiation. And I thought, how am I getting this book in the mail? And then I get a message from Brett saying, I want to talk to you. And so I start reading the book. And what he does nicely in the book, and I really love the book, part of it, I was sort of put on this path because I had sort of parroted some of the stuff that I had been taught theologically about assumptions about the Roman Catholic Eucharist. And one of my listeners, who was a very ardent Roman Catholic, said, "You're straw manning us. Here, listen to Bishop Barron about the Eucharist." I thought, well, I don't want to straw man anyone, And I listened to Bishop Barron, and it's like, huh, I don't know that. I don't know that I fully appreciated what the Roman Catholic position on the Eucharist was. And then I got Sockel's book and I read it. And one of the things that I noticed in that book was he makes the argument that part of the reason Luther goes so critically at Aquinas is because things underneath their worldview assumptions had shifted to the place that Luther wasn't really understanding Aquinas. And Sockel makes the argument that in many ways, what Luther was trying to do is to get back towards really what Aquinas, closer to what Aquinas was talking about, but because a lot of the philosophical assumptions beneath the culture had shifted, he couldn't hear Aquinas clearly. And what I'm seeing now is that a lot of these are assumptions about how the world works at a very basic level are changing. And that's disorienting. Now, fortunately, I think Christianity, I remember having a conversation with John Vervaeke, who identifies as a non-theist. And I remember him talking about his non-theism. And I remember listening to Bishop Barron talk about classical theism. And I'm saying, John, a lot of what has happened in the world is that people begin to believe that God is sort of like a super thing in the sky.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you look
Being
at
among other beings, just the biggest of all.
exactly, and if you begin to understand that that's actually really not what the church has said. It's not even really. And then I was reading this Jewish scholar, Ezekiel Kaufman, who in the 1930s really sort of sets the stage not for evolutionary monotheism, which is kind of this story that arose that, well, they kind of put the gods together and then you arrive at this monotheism, but at this radical Hebrew revolutionary monotheism that says basically you can't understand the Bible without understanding just the radical departure that the Hebrews made from every other system. And that this, in fact, aligns with this Christian conception of God, not one thing among other things, not a thing in the world, but and and so I began to see, oh, and that this perspective is actually in better alignment with a lot of the what we're learning about cognition, in that things aren't quite like we think they are. And this now sets up some really interesting dynamics in our current conversation, because I often watch in my comments, I read my comments fairly closely, where you'll have atheists and sort of modernists, Christians continuing to sort of align with each other. And I'm thinking, now this is really interesting. Now you hit some usual things and they'll depart, like you mentioned in terms of enchantment. What, for a while ago, I asked myself, this term supernatural, where does that occur? And I think the
Oh, yeah.
first the first element, I think it's Catherine of Siena. I mean, it's sort of again this really interesting early modern period. I also read Carlos Ayre's book, They Flew, which I found to be this fascinating book about levitation and Catholic saints, and all of this is happening in this period. And
Saint
it,
John Kappas,
yep,
whatever. Yeah, yeah.
yep. So to me, I think we are, as we're sort of leaving this 500-year period where we're all fighting along certain lines, and we should be reminded that at the beginning of the Reformation period, it was the Catholics that loved the miracles, and the Protestants were sort of the secularizers. But then there were other Protestants, like a lot of the Anabaptists, who were, tremendously miraculous. And I mean, it's an extraordinarily complex story, but I think we are getting to a point now where actually we can see once again the possibility of productive conversation that actually opens the door to the far deeper unity among the major houses of Christianity, even with the emerging worldview as science continues to sort of take apart modernity.
Yeah, I mean, as science itself begins to come apart in many ways.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this book by Peter Harrison, Some New World, by any chance?
No.
Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age. Peter Harrison's down in Australia. He teaches in Australia. I'm trying to get him on the show. I haven't emailed him yet, but I'm going to. Some New World. Well, his point in this book, it hits on something you just said. He talks about how the sharp distinction between this thing we call the supernatural and are living in this natural world. That's a very modern invention. And it's one of those things that arose in like the 16th, 17th centuries. You're talking those great cultural upheavals. In fact, my book on science and religion, The God of Covenant Creation, was essentially an intellectual genealogy that shows the shifting from this classical Ptolemaic worldview to this radically new Newtonian paradigm. And that necessitated a kind of mechanistic view of nature, which then necessitated the expulsion of God from the process. And so you would invent this very alienating thing called the supernatural, which
Mm-hmm.
Kant then reduces to sort of a moralism. And
Mm-hmm.
you get the witch's brew of so much of modern religiosity where the enchantment is banished. But we're recovering. Rod Dreher in his book, I don't know if you've seen this yet in your reading of it, Living in Wonder. A couple of times he says in there something you just said, which is the world is not what we think it is. Reality is not what we think it is. And Paul, I think that's kind of what we're rediscovering.
Yes.
Even many scientists now coming forward and saying, yeah, Darwinism, evolution, but we don't what we think that is probably isn't what it is, kind
Right.
of a thing.
Right. What's that? What's that, Nina?
The inside here,
What do you mean everything's moving?
the TV monitors, the lights,
Was there a little earthquake?
there must be something going on.
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't have a problem here then?
No, no, I'm fine.
Oh wow, this is the first for me. I'm interviewing someone. There's an earthquake going on apparently.
We get
Yes.
little tiny ones in Sacramento. We don't get that. Hopefully, well, I'll have to check the news, see if it's because usually if
Wow.
San Francisco really shakes, we get a little bit of something here. So it could be that there was a big one in San Francisco or one that wasn't too
Wow.
far away.
Oh,
So
that's I've only been in two earthquakes in my entire life here on the East Coast in northeastern PA, and both
could
one happened like 15 years ago now. It was centered in Virginia. It actually cracked the Washington Monument a little bit. And we felt it up in the Allentown area. But it's so anomalous here. It's so
yeah,
anomalous. Like
yeah.
at first, I mean, our whole building was shaking, and I'm going, "What the hell? What, construction on the roof? Who would do that?" We'd have all been dead. Seriously, that was a more serious quake. We'd have all been dead because the idea that we were suffering through an earthquake was the very last option on the list of things to check off. Like, oh, geez, we should get out of this building now. It's like earthquake, crazy. But anyway, yeah. I like you brought up, and this is one of the reasons why I love your podcast. And I mean, I could talk to you for hours about differences between Protestant Catholic theology and blah blah blah. But what really interests me is what we have in common with regard to a certain kind of modern public intellectual that is open to the faith, like a Jordan Peterson or a Jonathan Pagao. People like this, Rod Dreher obviously is a practicing Christian. So is Jonathan Pagao, but Jordan Peterson is more ambiguous.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on? Let's go down the list here. What are your thoughts on Jordan Peterson?
Well, I think so. A lot of my audience listens to me, and sometimes they come to me. Some of them have made their way into a church, and they say, "Well, I'm in church. I'm really glad I'm in church. It's going well." A lot of them in Roman Catholic churches. But I still sort of feel like a little bit of fish out of water. Nobody quite understands where I'm at. Nobody quite understands what I'm doing here and why I'm here, but I'm here and I'm going to stay. And then there's a lot of other ones that are like Peterson in that just actually yesterday, a young woman came in She's a relative of one of my deacons, and she's just a little bit short on her rent. And of course, come to the church and have benevolence fund. And yeah, sure, we'll
Yeah,
help you
right.
out and we'll get
Yeah.
you over. But she hasn't been in church now she's been in church for a few years. She's sort of fallen away. And for when I look at someone like that, and I know many like them, when they look at the church, they would say, I don't know what it's for. I don't know what it's for. And when I look back a couple of generations to my grandparents' generation. There, of course, were plenty then that would say that too. But people had an intuitive sense of what this is for, even if they couldn't articulate it. And so it became a priority for them. And I think someone like Jordan Peterson is his public project is clearly trying to publicly make sense of what he sees as the cultural tradition that has birthed, in his opinion, the greatest civilization that has ever been on the planet, which is Western civilization. And he wants to know why, because he sees Western civilization under threat. And so he hopes that if he can sort of in a modernist frame, if he is able to articulate in a sort of a modernist, overt, very Protestant way, how at least a certain amount of Christianity makes sense in a scientific world, then enough people will hold up the tradition to support the civilization. And so in that sense, Jordan Peterson isn't unlike how many Protestant and Catholic theologians and philosophers for the past number of hundred years who have looked for ways to save the church from modernity. Except Jordan is a little bit further down the line in that, partly because of his, you know, affinity to Jung, has an openness to that which we can't understand. And so in that way, he's an open agnostic. And so his answers to things like the resurrection, the virgin birth, they won't be confessionally Christian. Like, ask me, virgin birth. Yes. Did it happen? Yes.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't it have happened? That's just how I am. But of course, many people hear that and say, and so Jordan Peterson is trying to figure those things out. And fair enough. And I think he's doing the church a tremendous service in that. And I think there's also a sense in which part of people sometimes in this terribly fraught context ask me questions like, tell me, can you define for me what a Christian is? And my answer to that is a Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. And of course there's kind of wondering, because it didn't sound like the Apostles' Creed. And I'm not denying the Apostles' Creed, but for people today, it's like, okay. And I think for Jordan Peterson, at some point, how much did the thief on the cross know? My guess is not a lot. But in that moment, he could look across and see at least enough to say, one way or another, I'm going to trust this guy hanging on a cross next to me at a super basic level. And that's faith. And so at some point, and to what degree, I don't think I can look into Jordan Peterson's heart. And I certainly celebrate what God's doing through him. So I'm not in a place to critique him. But at some place for a Christian, there's a sense in which we say, I will trust God more than I trust myself. And almost all of human, you go all the way back to the garden. And one way to look at that moment was, I'm going to trust my ability to take this magic fruit and right there I think we see the beginnings of imagining that somehow that fruit has power apart from what God has given it. And right there we begin to see the divorce, the tear in the universe. And so that way I think my definition of a Christian is someone who finally says, I'm taking my hands off the sovereignty of my life and trusting that God finally will have me more than me.
Man, I love this. I'm going to steal this with attribution, of course. that a Christian is someone who finally sort of reaches the point where I trust Jesus. I trust this revelation more than I trust myself, because that's kind of a hermeneutical stance that one could take with regard to a lot of very vexing theological questions. If the salvific essence of faith is trust, then one could say, with regard to a lot of these debates about the inerrancy of Scripture, plenary inspiration, blah 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 blah. Well, just set all that aside and just say this: I trust the revelation of God in this book, and as a Catholic, and as it is unfolded in the Church's tradition, I trust that more than I trust myself.
Yeah.
And by that is what I mean by faith in revelation.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I place my trust in this more than I put it into myself. This is really great. I think that's a great way to put it, Paul.
So I see Jordan on this path, and his project, I sort of call it a stairway to heaven, because he's trying to figure out how he can sort of synchronize what he knows from cognitive science and evolutionary psychology with what he finds in the Bible, because he looks at it and says, this sort of breezy dismissal of it that we saw with the new atheists can't make any sense if, in fact, what this sort of and when I first discovered Tom Holland, I saw he's very much working on a similar vein as Jordan Peterson, because they're both recognizing that
Holland's not a believer, is he?
Oh, he is.
He is.
He is attending church quietly. He's British. You can't get these Brits to talk about themselves. You ask a personal question.
Well, because I've asked 100 people about Tom Holland. So I don't know. I don't know if he's a believer or not.
Well, if you look on the internet, if you look Tom Holland, Justin Brierley, he's a very unusual Brit, because he's always nosy. He always wheedles it out of his countrymen. But a big part of Holland's
for the viewers who don't understand, Tom Holland has written a very famous book called Dominion, which is a great book, sort of recounts the rise of Christianity and its pervasive influence in Western culture. But anyway, great book. Read it. And go ahead. I saw.
And so Tom, I had been in some communication with Tom, and Tom was someone who very much wanted to live again in a much more enchanted world. But like many of the people that I talked to on my channel, was having difficulty getting there, because these assumptions that are drilled into us in our culture, I think a lot of it is a status game, is if you start to say things like, I believe in the virgin birth, or I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you will lose status with certain kinds of people. And I think that holds a lot of people back. But then Tom had you can find him talk about this on the internet, so I'm not telling tales out of school. He was having a particular health scare, and he was really praying, and he was in a church, and he actually had a Marian vision, which of course should bother Protestants a lot more than Catholics. But you see, again, people ask me, what kind of Calvinist are you? Well, I'm a really minimalist Calvinist in the sense that, you know what? God, salvation is of the Lord. Book of Jonah. God is the one that moves our hearts to him. That is what I think is at the heart of Calvinism, and I don't think this is anti-Catholic at all. I hear Catholics say the same thing. It's not that we sort of figure out our way back to God. Usually, God helps us find our way back to him, but it's God who nobody can save but the Lord. And so Tom Holland goes into this church, and he's anxious about this medical situation he has. And of course, for a long time, he's sort of been praying and longing for God to show up. And here God shows up to him in a vision of the Virgin Mary in a church. And that's why people say, well, Anglicans are Protestant. I'm like, some Anglicans are Protestant. So, so I think Tom Holland is increasingly comfortable identifying as a Christian, because, and this is, again, as a pastor, one of the things you learn, and Protestants sometimes badly this way, we want people to, we want transformation and conversion to happen on our clock, in our process, with our fingerprints on it. You want to know what happens with people? God, and the point God takes his time, and the point I usually use for this, for Protestants especially, is the Apostle Paul. Read in the book of Acts. He's right there at the stoning of Stephen, and the heavens open, and Stephen can see the heavens, and all of that, and Paul's sitting right there. And I ask, if God could interrupt him on the road to Damascus, he was already there talking to Stephen. You think he could have looked over at Paul and say, "See me now?" No, he doesn't. Why? It was God's plan for Saul of Tarsus to persecute the church and to get all the way to Damascus, and God picks the time and the method. And it is salvation is of the Lord. It is God's thing. And so I can see God working through Tom Holland. I can see God working through Jordan Peterson. I can see God working through John Vervaeke. And I'm
Yeah.
again, once you make the leap that God is God and I am not, you begin to have to set yourself up for, it is going to be God's sovereignty over all of these other people more than my little plan for the universe and how I think things should happen.
Oh, amen. Amen. I think that's very true. I think that's a great way to put it. And to go back to Tom Holland, it, the burning question, and this is something I'd really like your opinion on, is you hear people talk all the time about we live in a post-Christian era, or even a post-Christian era, and a post-liberal era, and post this and post toasties or whatever. And that's certainly one sort of valid way of engaging in a kind of intellectual taxonomy to try to figure out where we are. But the Lord is bigger than that, is kind of what you've been talking about. Then I'm haunted by Tom Holland's thesis, though, that the entirety of the modern world has been irreversibly altered by the introduction of Christianity into the bloodstream of humanity, and that it is ineradicable, in a sense, the change that has taken place. Yeah. So the question for you is, in light of Tom Holland and everything we've been talking about, how post-Christian are we? I was just reminded of this. I read a tweet from John Milbank today. You know John Milbank, the great theologian, and I like John. And he was quoting a thinker and intellectual, John Gray, in his book, The New Leviathans. And Gray's thesis, and Milbank was approving of it, was that all of this criticism that we now read of so-called woke culture, and a lot of conservative Christians are saying, well, woke culture is an expression of cultural Marxism and critical Marxist theory and so forth. Gray's thesis and Milbank's, and this is interesting, is that no, it's not. And it's interesting, too. I'm reading a book. I'm going to be interviewing him on Saturday. I came to Cast Fire, an introduction to Rene Girard by Father Elias Carr, an introduction to Rene Girard, Elias Carr. And so I have Rene Girard on the mind as well. That woke culture isn't so much the product of a post-Christian critical Marxist understanding and deconstruction of things, as it is a kind of a form of Christianity on steroids.
Yes.
In other words, one of the things that Girard points out in Holland as well, one of the things that Christianity introduces into the matrix of human civilization is the concern for the victim.
Yes.
The concern for the scapegoat. And that from that point forward, through many failures, of course, all kinds of failures, nevertheless, the Ariadne's thread that runs throughout church history, both Protestant and Catholic, is this increasing appreciation for and empathy with the marginal. You worked with the Haitians, the marginalized, oppressed victim. Woke culture is simply victim status writ large and transferred into the sphere of sexual minorities in particular. Do you agree with that thesis? I see you shaking your head.
100%. Yep. It is a variant of Christianity. But it is a particularly, I like, Alistair McGrath wrote this little book on heresy.
Yeah, I know it well.
Yeah. And I love his definition of heresy. Some people say it's not exactly what he says, but it's my take of what he says here, is that what heresies finally are spirits, we'll call them spirits that finally push things to a degree that they are their own undoing. And you can see this all the way through. McGrath in that book will talk about like the Donatist controversy,
Right. Right.
where okay, so the church has a tremendous challenge there, where you have priests who denied the Lord under threat of persecution. What are you going to do with these priests? And what are you going to do with with those that those priests had baptized? And of course, you've got apostolic tradition. I mean, this is a terrible mess. And eventually, the Catholic take wins. And one of the tremendous one of the tremendous things that the Roman Catholic Church has going for it is it's just still here. And that's saying something. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I think wokeness is completely so, and that's sort of where I came from because, of course, I was raised in a racial reconciliation church during the civil rights movement. And so this stuff was in my bloodstream. And I was, in all sorts of ways, I was on the progressive end of a conservative Protestant denomination. And it got to be about the early 20 teens, and I began noticing some people in my denomination talking in a certain way about sexual minorities, and I began thinking, I, I'm almost hearing, and I tend to call it progressive liberationism. I'm almost hearing a different gospel from, let's say, the one that the Christian Reformed Church had that there's sort of a different gospel and a different group of saints and there's this whole thing developing here. And it certainly grows out of Christianity. You can't understand it without Christianity. And actually, Tom Holland, in one of his earlier podcasts on The Rest is History, they treated Marxism. And he basically said, you can't understand Marxism without Christianity. But all of these
Yes.
threads just sort of go. And, we saw that Marxism it doesn't work. It is unstable. And I think we're going to find the same thing with wokeism too. And it just falls apart eventually. So, but I think yes, I think Tom Holland's thesis is right that Jesus, and it's actually the last video I made talks about this. Jesus has a way of sneaking. I'm just going to use a cyber metaphor here. Jesus has a way of sneaking his code into people in a very strange way. And that when Jordan Peterson challenges Sam Harris by basically saying, "You've got a ton of Christianity in you," and Sam is just, oh, oh, oh. Of course he does. His entire moral imaginary of the
Yeah.
West has been deeply shaped by the by Jesus, moral teaching, and you can't get away from it. And again, part of what Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson shared was can can the moral imaginary of the West be sustainable without the living root of cruciform sacrificial faith? Because you can't actually programatize love for the marginalized because their marginalization itself isn't something. And in fact there might be elements that they need to address in that
Bingo.
keeps them marginalized. And this is one thing that you learn as a pastor, that okay, so maybe someone's they've been born to the wrong family, racially they're out of step with the group, all of these things, and tremendous injustice has been done to them. But the path, there's a reason why both Peter and Paul, who are killed by the Roman Empire, say these crazy things like, submit to the king. What do you mean? What do you mean? Well, it's
Yeah.
because finally, and I just finished preaching a sermon on the book of Daniel. Finally, Daniel was the best servant of the local monarch because his primary allegiance was to the God of the universe. And so when these guys decide to set him up in Daniel 6, and Daniel's like, I'm going to continue to pray, and they can throw me into the lion's den, but the king understands that he's been duped, and so he's cheering for Daniel's safety. I mean, this plays out again and again and again. In other words, again, and I think it has fundamentally to do with idolatry, that we perpetually look for something that we can, Flannery O'Connor put this great about this one guy in one of her books. I don't remember what it was.
Paul, you're damn near a Catholic, all
Yeah,
right.
I know.
Now you're quoting Flannery O'Connor and all this, talking about Tom Holland's Marian apparition.
but she has this great line where this
Yeah,
guy thought he wouldn't need Jesus if he could avoid sin. And I thought she just put her finger on it right there, that finally Jesus is God. Jesus,
yeah,
and where you're going to stand in however our threads continue to work after the grave into new heavens and a new earth, and however God manages that, Jesus is Lord. That's finally what a Christian is. And so when you
amen.
decide that marginalization is Lord, now you've sort of set up an idol, and idols always disappoint.
Well, that's a great way to put it. Idols. That's like Eugene McCarraher's book, The Enchantments of Mammon. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a great book, great big thick book. It'd take you a lifetime to read. The Enchantments of Mammon, Eugene McCarraher. He goes against the Weberian, disenchantment thesis and all that. Where he says, no, we're not a disenchanted culture. We just have really pissy, bad enchantments.
Yes.
They're idolatrous, and like
Yes.
all idolatries, they're counterfeit. They leave us cold. So I like that. All idolatries sort of leave us cold and disappoint us. But I want to come back to this notion of marginalization, because I think you put your finger on something really important in terms of our current political situation and our response to it as Christians, be that Protestant or Catholic. And it's this, that yes, what you see is this common argument that's put forward, which is first you identify a particular group, and you say, well, okay, this is the XYZ community. We always have to say whatever it is now a community, some sort of identity marker. Then you say historically they've been marginalized and persecuted, and then from there you go on to say, and we need to lift that persecution by legitimating them.
Right.
Now, traditionally, the oppressed, margins were racial, ethnic, national, linguistic, gender, like the subjugation of women, that sort of thing. These were things that are more identified with something that you're really born with. Whereas now it seems like your behaviors, if they are what have led to your marginalization, those behaviors are now legitimated. We're going to rehabilitate them and legitimate. The only way to make you a non-victim is to legitimate the behaviors that have turned you into someone on the margins. I'm kind of rambling now, but you get my point.
Yep. Oh, we've watched that. Well, I think we set up all of these systems because, well, okay, if we can codify the particular aspect of their marginalization, then we can create a rule and a system by which we, eliminate the marginalization. But as Jonathan Pachot has pointed out many times, once you do this, you're just going to set up a new marginalization.
Yes.
You're going to set up a new marginalized group. I mean, this is a never-ending thing. But I think the key thing to watch in this is, why are we trying to systematize it and legalize it? And when, I remember my conversation with you and your personal history in terms of, workers' movements and all of this. I mean, there's no question that, especially in the period of industrialization, workers were horribly treated and taken advantage of. And so, many different movements that have happened out of the, that flow out of Christian civilization, where we have child labor laws and we have protection for women and protection for labor. All of these are wonderful, good things. But what makes us nervous about this and why we want to systematize it all the time, and again, the systems themselves aren't necessarily bad, is we can't trust love. Because what is at the heart of all of this is love. And the truth is, I think about my father's own story. My father grew up mostly in very white Midwest, and and I don't know that he ever saw an African American, with the possible exception of if he took a train and saw someone working, a Pullman
Yeah.
porter or something like that. And so then he comes to Patterson. But my grandfather was just a extremely caring, loving man. And so my father then moves to Patterson, New Jersey, is now deeply embedded in all sorts of African Americans that move up from the Jim Crow South, escaping legalized segregation. But now they're in the North facing different kinds of racism, because racism in the North was different from the racism in the South, which many had noticed. And, but so how can he minister to a people he didn't know or understand? He could do so because he understood love
That's right.
and he practiced love. But here's the thing: you can't legislate love. But by its very nature, it is always a gift. It is always a gift. And it is a cruciform gift, which is, again, what's at the heart of Christianity. It's the God of the universe, not under any compulsion, but freely giving himself for a rebellious creation that doesn't even know what Jesus says from the cross. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And this, but we can't trust love. And there's a reason we can't trust human beings to love, because we're not good at it.
Yeah.
But it is of course,
Yeah.
and it is why, and I just preached on Daniel 6 last week, and it's interesting that at the end of Daniel 6, Darius proclaims to the entire realm that Daniel's God is the one true God, and everyone should only worship Daniel's true God. And I think there's a whole bunch of people that should pay attention to this verse, because that is what so many people are dreaming of from their national government, that if only the president of the United States would affirm my sort of Christianity. And we just had a Roman Catholic president who's going out right now. So the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, Roman Catholic, and plenty of evangelicals are out there. And, when George W. Bush came in and, oh, he's an evangelical president, yada, yada, yada. Darius does this. And you know what? The Persian Empire, still a Persian Empire.
That's right.
And Jesus is killed by the Romans, and on the cross says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. But Jesus' way actually has brought about the kind of transformation in the world that Darius's way didn't. And I think that all boils down to, well, once you take that step of saying, okay, Lord, I'm going to trust you more than I'm going to trust me, now I'm going to have to trust other people and God's sovereignty over this whole mess. And,
wow.
Yeah.
I apologize. My phone's been doing some strange things here. I forgot to shut it off, and I missed. I hope that was recording on the thing, because I missed a lot of them. Crazy. It's strange because my phone is hooked up to the Zoom somehow or strange. So if it rings, everything cuts off and the phone starts talking to me in my headpiece. And,
this kept on fine. So this was fine.
That's good. That's very good. That's very good. But I got the very end of what you were saying and the beginning. And this is great, because I kind of wanted to sort of end our conversation today by moving a little bit into that political realm, into the political domain. People who listen to me know that I actually do not vote. I follow the politics of Dorothy Day, who was a self-described anarchist. And by that, she didn't mean she didn't believe in any kind of governance. It meant that she opposed the Leviathan of the modern state and the corruptions of the modern state and the military-industrial complex. You get the picture.
Yep.
And she believed that voting was a kind of illusion, a kind of anesthesia, a grand mythology that the powers that be have created in order to placate the masses. Now, I understand that's controversial, and I'm not I'm
I
not
see her
telling,
point.
and I'm not telling those who listen to me to follow that example or my example. I'm just
But you live in Pennsylvania. Your vote counts. I live in
oh yeah.
California. It doesn't matter who I vote for.
Well, except yeah, and I've been told that over and you live in a swing state for crying out loud. But you miss my point. My point is that I don't think it matters who wins the election. So if I were to vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, it doesn't matter. This is my point. And I often point out to people, I was in London in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, and Londoners were euphoric. And when they figured out I was an American, they were patting me on the back. Oh, you must be so happy. You've just elected Jesus Christ as president of the United States. The Messiah, it's it's Eric Vogelin's nightmare, the immanentizing of the eschaton and on steroids. I mean, it was really bizarre to see the response of Londoners. And, I knew as an American all that si se puede, yes, we can, and blah, blah, blah. Well, the president of si se puede is now a filthy, stinking rich man. Friends of Wall Street. His economic team was Goldman Sachs. He now has a mansion in Martha's Vineyard. He has a mansion in Hawaii. He is now retired to, cavorting with celebrities and Taylor Swift and whatnot. And I don't mean, and I don't particularly hate Barack Obama, but I consider him, and we say, okay, Donald Trump is now going to drain the swamp. He didn't drain the swamp when he was president the first time, and he happens to be a swamp creature. So, do you really want to hire a swamp creature to drain your swamp for you? That's sort of counterproductive on their end. I don't know. He's maybe just vindictive enough to go ahead and drain the swamp, because, hey, I'm already rich and I'm 78 years old. What do I care? So I don't know. I really don't know. And I'm not anti-Trump. I'm not pro-Trump. My point is that, trust not in chariots,
Yep.
and there's a certain, for example, I say this and I'll let you speak. People say, well, not voting, Dorothy Day's not voting. We have an obligation to be involved in the political process. Hey, not voting is a political act. There's a kind of apolitical politics. And I'm reminded of a quote from Joseph Ratzinger in Introduction to Christianity, later Pope Benedict, where I can't remember, I have to look the quote up, but I'm paraphrasing, where he says, the affirmation, there is one God, precisely because it has no direct political ramifications, is of the greatest political significance. Because that effort goes back to what you were talking about with regard to Daniel and the rise of radical Jewish monotheism as something utterly new in the world. And this is Ratzinger's point, that this radical monotheistic and later Christian modification of that affirmation is the most political thing ever, precisely in its apolitical sort of, you know what I'm talking about.
Yep. We are in a point right now where I often say religion is dollars, politics is cents. Religion is always, politics is now. So religion and politics will always be connected. They will always be connected. There won't be, they're not separate magisteria. They're not that. And I was reading John O'Malley. So I was in Italy this summer because one of my sons decided he wanted to do a destination wedding. And so then it's like, well, I'm going to go to Italy. I'm going to go to Italy. And so I started at Pompeii. I was in Naples and then went to Rome and then went to Florence and then went to Milan and then went to Venice. It was a great vacation. I visited a ton of churches. But it got me interested in the history of the papacy because, the papacy as a Protestant is kind of a weird thing. We're always kind of looking over. And I remember so I didn't know much about the history of the papacy. And then I started reading a couple of books on the Pius, the popes during the Second World War. And it's a fascinating history.
Pius the 12th, yeah.
And the 11th. And the rise of Mussolini and of course, the Pope before that was sort of the prisoner of the Vatican, and the Pope wasn't traveling. I mean, it's a fascinating history. And then I thought, then I made some comments about that book, and I'm probably, oh, that's, you should read. So then I was reading O'Malley's history of the papacy, and what he said about Constantine was just fascinating, and that part of what we run into with Constantine is this question that here you have a pagan emperor who, whatever on earth was happening with Constantine in terms of his own personal evolution into Christianity, but he has to figure out, how does God's sovereignty interact with princes and kings? And of course, so much of the Bible is about that. I mean, when you read, it's the rise of David and Saul, and then it's the prophets and the kings, and then you have the New Testament period, and Jesus, sort of radically changes a whole bunch of things. So, one of the things that I see right now is the ongoing conversation in our culture about, once again, questions of religion and politics. How do
Yeah.
these things and how should these things interact? And the truth is that within Christianity, we've had a very interesting panoply of approaches to this. And I think that's a very live conversation. And I think it's really one of the more important conversations we have now. And it's interesting too, even within the Roman Catholic realm, you've got everything from, popes holding, secular authority in places in Italy, all the way to Ivan Illich. I mean, it's just like, this is all within
Yeah.
your church. So and now it's happening in Protestants where you have, it's so funny, you have this name, Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism, absolutely, it's a huge thing.
And that sort of,
and the Catholic version of that is the Christ the King movements,
right,
that sort
right.
of thing.
And now you have the Orthodox coming along. At least a portion of the Orthodox are sort of like, make Constantine great again. And then Paul Kingsnorth gives this speech at First Things
I
against
saw
Christian.
that.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, we are living in super interesting times, because these questions are also not disconnected from the questions that we were talking about a little bit earlier with respect to science and epistemology and
Sure.
ontology. That very much what we had in the cultural movement was, okay, we're going to have this separation of church and state pioneered by the United States, where, but then you have to ask the question, okay, but how do we arrive at common truth? And for that reason, religion and politics and philosophy and epistemology and ontology, these things are never fully separable. And so when in the very early church, they declare that Jesus is Lord very clearly against the cult of Caesar as Lord. Okay, what does Jesus' lordship have to do with the princes and the kings and all of that? And we've been wrestling with those questions right from the start. And so I think we are going to continue to wrestle with them, but I think the piece that a lot of people are going to miss is that what's happening at this deeper level, when I look at the real questions being asked about cognition and how we interact with the strangeness of the world.
Yeah.
How is this then going to figure into our politics? And it comes out, I think Dreer has been prescient in many respects. I remember I started reading Dreer, and he's really going on about, Obergefell and all this is going to do. And I was much more skeptical. It's like, well, it's kind of being alarmist. But the further we go into it, it's like, no, he really had a point. And, now he's writing about aliens and all of this stuff. And it's,
I was with you. I mean, for the longest time, I thought Rod Dreher is just obsessed with LGBTQ stuff.
yeah.
Obsessed, obsessed, obsessed. And yet I think he's prescient because he saw this is where it's all headed.
Yeah. And I think it's the same with all these things that are sort of on the margin right now. And, maybe it's something similar to against Carlos Ayer's book, They Flew, where at these turning points, things sort of come on loose and you get a lot of weirdness. And, I I think these levitating saints are it's just an absolutely fascinating thing. But I think these are signs to us of, oh, little man, your little systems and visions about the little boxes within which you organize
Yeah.
your world, you'd better be a little bit humble about them, because when it comes right down to it, this crazy little monk that keeps flying up into the air, you know, God, God is going to use strange people and strange things.
Excuse me.
And
Yes. Oh, he is.
how we put this together, well, I think we should again,
No,
you
you're right.
follow that lamb.
You're absolutely right. I'm thinking, and these are questions that I mean, they go back millennia to
Yep.
the very origins of the Christian faith. And we're certainly not going to answer them in a podcast. But also, I think one of the reasons why the questions keep arising is that they address issues that are fundamentally irreducible to political solution.
Yes.
We keep trying to seek political solutions because we're political animals. We're
Yes.
incarnational beings, and that's fine. But lose sight of the fact that the politics are not the be all and end all things. But the difference is, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in the Catholic world, there was a great theological debate in the 20th century in France between two giant Catholic theologians, Garrigou-Lagrange on the one hand and Henry de Lubac on the other. De Lubac was more of a nouveau theologie, Lagrange more of a old line Thomist, but that translated then into Lagrange was very much part of what was l'Action Française, which was a restorationist. Let's bring back the monarchy. This
Yep.
is the solution.
Yep.
Monarchism, down
Yep.
with the secularism of the Republic. De
Yep.
Lubac was part of a movement called Catholic Action. They're both political movements. Action
Yep.
Française, Catholic Action was no. Forget the restorationist stuff. We need to pay attention to rebuilding culture brick by brick by brick
Yep.
by brick. Now, I'm
Yep.
more sympathetic with de Lubac than I am with Lagrange. And that would be my attitude as well. And I wonder what you think about. You don't want to necessarily, we don't want to become modern. I like to say, we don't want to become modern day Catholic Essenes or Protestant Essenes running off to our compound in the desert with our buried school buses and our Bibles embossed with hand grenades and whatnot, waiting for the comeuppance to all those others. We don't want to do that. This is not a dialectical moment so much as it is an analogical moment where we do need to seek common ground. But nevertheless, I just keep coming back to the fact that so many of our problems are irreducible to political solutions, and yet we keep seeking those. I mean,
Yes.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the old saying, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And
Yeah.
I think what you just described is one of the problematic elements of what had turned out to be modern secularism. That finally the only kind of solutions we could have were political. And there have been many people sort of on the fringes that have been saying, while there is better and worse politics, there is always that, and policy is important. And we obviously a nation under a good king or a good president or a good system will be better off than one under another. Again, back to this thing, you cannot systematize love.
Right.
Love is finally unsystematizable. And the difficulty, of course, is that you in a structured loving life, there will be systems, but all of those systems must finally bend to love. And you know this if you have multiple children, because one of the things that once you have multiple children, you have a house with rules, but then you discover that you're going to flex the rules for some of your kids more than others. And are you going to get it absolutely right? Probably not. But you realize that love requires it.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with questions of pastoral care with respect to people with same-sex attraction, or how many other kinds of pastoral issues that evolve. You're going to have to approach each individual with love, and systems and structures are going to be part of a loving environment. But finally, at the top of the hierarchy is a person loving. And again, part of what I think the Christian faith says is that is what is at the top of this very strange thing that we are involved in called life in the cosmos or the universe, that at the top of this is a God of love. And, but again, contemporary part of the contemporary heresy is that love always means saying yes. It's like, yeah, no parent buys this. Um, I mean,
Yeah.
we've embraced so
Yeah.
much idiocy that anyone with any
Yeah.
common sense hears it and says, "No, love does
Yeah.
not mean always saying yes."
If you have a friend who's an alcoholic, the last thing in the world you do is give him a bottle of bourbon for Christmas and say, there you go. You know, I've given you what you desire. I've given you what you want, which is a
Although there
bottle of
might be
booze.
a time in which that's exactly what you do to make your point. Because it's like, you
Yeah.
don't want to be sober? Here you go. Drink yourself to death. But that would come in the midst of a long-term conversation where there's self-knowledge on both sides, where, and pastorally, I had a friend in this church who was a longtime 12-stepper, and and when he'd go out to try and help drunks, he would often go out with a little bit of something in his pocket because he knew he had to put a little bit in them, but then he'd take them to detox. I mean, it's all part of a system of love. And anybody who's, let's say, an Al-Anon also knows that the way to solve alcoholism isn't to become the take up the mantle of I'm not going to allow my husband to drink. No, we call that codependence. And so again,
Yeah.
we can have no law higher than the law that Christ gives us, which is to love. But then we begin to discover, oh my, loving is costly, which again is exactly what
Yes.
the cross tells us. But it's
Yes.
also enormously complex, and it doesn't mean the same thing for every person.
And probably nothing vexes modern thought, even in its secular guise, than the complete confusion around the word love and what love is and what love
Yes.
entails and what love demands. And perhaps we could end here in the sense, I mean, this is what I'm always on about, the need for sanctity, the need for a conversion of heart. That's the evangelical part of me coming out, that nothing works unless there's conversion, for
Yeah.
crying out loud, conversion to
Yeah.
Christ. But perhaps the single most political thing that Christians can do today is to help our culture figure out what love is,
Yes.
what its demands are, what
Yes.
it looks like, and what its downstream sort of moral demands are and consequences are, you know?
And I think that's, when you look at, a lot of people love the end of the book of Matthew. I like the beginning of the book of Acts because, they're up on this mountain and the apostles are around and they say, "Now will you restore the kingdom to Israel?" Again, they're thinking politics too.
They
And
still
Jesus,
haven't gotten it.
they
Yeah.
still haven't gotten it. The crucifixion, the resurrection, the eating the fish, and they've seen it all. They've seen the miracles.
They got
Now will
almost,
you?
she's, oy vey, oy
Yeah.
vey.
And he's very gentle with them at that moment. He's not always gentle with them. Well, you have little faith, but now he's very gentle. He says, it's not for you to know the times or the hours, but you will receive power and you will be my witnesses. And again, what I like to stress with people is that the power that Jesus gives is actually the power to love. And that usually means the power to suffer for,
Yeah.
suffer with, the power, which is again exactly what we see on the cross. You will be my witnesses. And so what we've seen again and again through the age is that Christians are at their best when they are learning to love. And again, they're not, they read the Sermon on the Mount. They're not doing it, they're letting their light shine, but they're not doing it for the acclaim of men. And in whatever sphere that they have their domain, they practice love and they do their best at it. And none of us ever get it right, completely right. But that is what we see in the cross. It's not the decrees of Darius. It's the love that Christ shows us on the cross that finally opens our eyes and says, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.
Yes. Wow. I think that, I mean, gosh, you put it so well. That, why don't we end there? Why don't we end with love? All right. All you need is love, right? All right. So yeah, we'll end with love. Do you have any last words for the viewers before
Well,
we sign off here?
I'm just really happy to be here, and I know that we definitely have overlap in our viewership. I mean, early on, even before we
Yeah.
talked the first time, a lot of people said, "Oh, you got to talk to Larry Chapp. You got to talk to Larry Chapp."
Yeah.
So you've
And
got
I
a
had the
good
same with you.
reputation.
People were saying, "Oh, Vander Klay, you got to talk to Paul Vander Klay." And then Kale Zeldin, hey Kale, shout out.
Yeah.
Finally happened.
Well,
Thank you so. Go ahead.
I would say that I am delighted by the fact that there's a lot of things a lot of things to mourn in our day and time. But I am delighted by the fact that you and I, as a Dutch Calvinist clergyman and a Roman Catholic scholar, can enjoy a communion like this right
Yes.
now and meet each
Yes.
other. You know, it's so funny because when I was a child, the in Whitensville, Massachusetts, where my mother lives and was from, the Christian Reformed Church and the Roman Catholic Church are right across the street from each other. And in my grandparents' era, never the two would meet. And
Right.
now, they're having Thanksgiving services together. They share each other's parking lot when they're a big event. The priest and the pastor on a first name basis. I am, you know, I believe that Christ, when he desires for his church to be one, we are finding new ways to be one, and I praise God for that.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
people might be prone to despair and pessimism. I don't think any Christian should fall prey to that because finally Jesus
Yes.
is Lord, God is on the throne, his kingdom will come, his will be done on earth as in heaven. That's the gospel. So we should be of good
Absolutely.
cheer.
And I agree completely. We do not have sacramental communion with one another, but we have the union of baptismal hearts and the union of Christian faith. And yes, that is something to be thankful for in the modern world, despite all of the chaos in the modern churches and certain elements of a false ecumenism, where that
Yep.
would simply say, "Oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter."
Yeah.
Uh, Moments like this can happen, and
Yeah.
thank God that they are. But
Yeah.
anyway, thanks, Paul, for coming on the show. Thank you so much, and everybody. I'll try and link to your blog and all that sort of stuff in the program notes before I post this up, so everybody uh, can go and see Paul Vander Klay and his wonderful guests on your show and so on. So thanks for everyone for listening, and thanks, Paul, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Larry. It's good to talk to you.